Previously, we learned that a chemical formula will tell you the ratio of atoms present in a compound. We've also learned how to identify whether something is a molecular compound or an ionic compound. We're going to put those two things together and we're going to decide when we look at a compound how many ions are present. In order to do this, you'll also need to know your polyatomic ions. This page is not specifically in your notes, so you may want to get out an extra piece of paper to take notes onto. This is to help answer one of the questions on one of your exercises. The question says, how many ions are there? I'm going to also answer how many atoms are present. So we're going to look at a bunch of formulas and names, and then we're going to decide how many atoms are present, how many ions are present. In order to answer the number of ions question, you're going to need to know the type and classification of these compounds. So I'm going to start by just showing you the first two and leaving you to try the rest of them, and then I'll show you the answer for those. So let's start with zinc carbonate. That is its name. It's ZnCO3, and we want to count how many atoms there are. So in the formula, we can see that there is one zinc, one carbon, 3 oxygens, and that is a total of 5 atoms. To answer the number of ions, though, we need to do a little bit more. So for this, we're going to see what type of compound is it. Is it ionic or molecular? If it's ionic, then we know that we have ions. If it's molecular, the number of ions will be 0. So let's look into this. To decide if it's ionic or molecular, the first thing you should observe is that the first element is a metal. That tells us that this is ionic. We're going to go ahead and classify it just for extra practice. So this one is a salt, because remember the choices are base or salt, and this one's a salt. And then the next thing is how many ions. So we see that there is one zinc ion and one carbonate ion for a total of 2 ions. There are many more atoms than there are ions for this. And then the last thing is just to name it, and this is just for extra practice. And remember, with the names, we put the cation that's listed first, and again, if it has 2 choices, we have to write the parentheses and figure out what the charge is. In this case, we have zinc, which has only one choice. It's going to be a 2 charge, but we don't have to write that. And then the CO3 is carbonate, so our answer is zinc carbonate. Next, we have BrF5. How many atoms are present? There's 1 Br, 5 fluorines, and that gives us a total of 6 atoms. Next, we're going to look at the type. Is this ionic or molecular? The first element is bromine. Bromine is a nonmetal, so that means this is a molecular compound. Then we're going to classify it, and the classes for molecular compounds are acid or covalent, and this one is covalent because it doesn't start with H or hydrogen. Since in the previous step I said it was molecular, that tells me that the number of ions is 0. Let's just go ahead and name this for some practice. So we have Br first, so we're going to write bromine. This should have just 1 in front of it, but we don't write the mono in front of the first one, so this is just bromine. And then the second part is fluoride. Remember to spell it correctly, Fluoride. And then we're going to say how many there are, and there are 5, so it's penta. So it's bromine pentafluoride. So go ahead and try the rest of them, pause the video, and then come back to me and we'll show you the rest of the answers. Alrighty, so we have Sb, parentheses, NO2, parentheses, 3. Sb, we've got 1 atom. How many nitrogens do we have? Well, we have 3 times 1, so there's 3. That means we have 4 so far, plus 2 times 3 for the oxygen, which is 6, so total of 10 atoms. What type of compound do we have? We start with antimony, which is a metal, and so we have an ionic compound. The choices of those are base or salt. This one is a salt, and the number of ions that we have 1 antimony and 3 nitrites, so we get a total of 4 ions. And the name of this is going to be antimony, parentheses, Roman numeral 3, nitrite. Alrighty, the next one. We have H2SO3. There are 2 hydrogens, 1 sulfur, and 3 oxygens for a total of 6 atoms. When we classify this, we start with hydrogen, which is a non-metal. If it's a non-metal, that makes this a molecular compound. As soon as I know it's molecular, that means there are 0 ions. The classification for this will be an acid because it starts with H, and the name for this will be hydrogen sulfite, ITE. And now we have Pb parentheses SO4 parentheses 2. The total number of atoms, we have 1 lead, 2 sulfurs, that's 3 so far, plus 8 oxygens. That gives us a total of 11 atoms. What type of compound is this? We have lead first, that's a metal. That means this is ionic, so we will have ions present. The classification on this will be a salt. We don't have a hydroxide at the end. The number of ions, we have 1 lead and 2 sulfates, total of 3 ions. For the name of it, lead has 2 choices, so we're going to put lead parentheses, and then we're going to fill that in a moment. And then we have sulfate, SO4 is sulfate. We have 2 of those sulfates. Sulfate has a -2 charge. That means that the total charge for the lead must be 4. So we have lead, Roman numeral 4, sulfate. And our next one is fluorine and iodine. I know it looks like an L, that is not an L. So we have 2 atoms, 1 F and 1 I. Fluorine is a nonmetal, so we're going to see that the type is going to be molecular. In this case, we have a covalent compound because it does not start with hydrogen. The number of ions will be 0. Remember, anything that's molecular will have 0 ions because it is molecular, not ionic. And the name for this will be fluorine, remember to spell it correctly with a UO, monoiodide. And yes, we do have all those I's and O's all put together for the name. Alrighty, next one. We have parentheses, Hg subscript 2, parenthesis, subscript 3, parenthesis, PO4, parenthesis, subscript 2. A lot of stuff going on in this one. So how many mercuries do we have? It looks like we have 2 times 3, so a total of 6 mercuries. We have 2 phosphoruses and 8 oxygens, which gives us a total of 16 atoms. What type of compound do we have? We start with mercury. Mercury is a metal, and so this is ionic. Our choices for ionic compounds are bases or salts. This one is a salt, and so the number of ions will be 3 mercury ions and 2 phosphate ions, a total of 5 ions. For the name on this one, we have mercury. Mercury has 2 choices, so we're going to put the parentheses, and the second part is phosphate. In this case, the phosphate has a 3 negative charge. There are 2 of them, so it becomes a total of -6. The mercury has to have a total of 6 positive charges. We have 3 of them. Each of those must have a mercury with a 2+ charge, but there's a 2 subscript, which tells us that this is mercury 1 phosphate. And our last one is water. So water has H2O. It has 3 atoms. This one starts with hydrogen, which is a nonmetal, so its type is molecular. That tells us immediately that our number of ions will be 0. For classifying this, it does start with an H, which would normally tell us it's an acid, but remember this one is not an acid. It is covalent. It is the exception to the rule. And then this name could be dihydrogen monoxide, as we've talked about before, or we could just simply call it water. So that's how you figure out the number of atoms or the number of ions given a formula. Next, we're going to look at it. What if I give you the name? What do you have to do? When we're given the name, we have to go through one extra step. We have to figure out what the formula is. And in order to figure out the formula, we need to know what type and class of compound we have. So I'm going to do the first 2, and then I'll leave the rest of them for you to try, and then I'll follow up with the answers. Okay, so we have ammonium sulfate. Ammonium is not a metal, but it is an ion that we know. So we know this is an ionic compound. So we have ammonium as our type is ionic, classification. In this case, we have a salt. Again, we do not have a hydroxide. For our formula, we need to write out each of the ions. So ammonium is NH4+, sulfate is SO4, 2 negative. We want to make sure we have both of those polyatomics in their parentheses. And then we're going to see that we have a subscript 2 for the ammonium and a 1 for the sulfate, so we have to erase the parentheses. So that means that our formula then is parentheses NH4 subscript 2 SO4. And that means our number of atoms For the NH4, there are 2 of those, so that is a total of 10 atoms, plus SO4, which is 5 more atoms, for a total of 15 atoms. But for ions, this is an ionic compound, so it will have ions. For ions, we should only see 2 for ammonium plus 1 for sulfate, a total of 3 ions. Next, we have dinitrogen pentasulfide. And for this classification, we see that it does start with a nonmetal, nitrogen, and so the classification is molecular. That immediately tells us our number of ions is 0, so we don't really have to do the rest of it to find out the ions. We'll go ahead and do the rest. Once we know it's molecular, our 2 choices are acid or covalent. This does not start with hydrogen, so it is a covalent compound. The formula tells us exactly what we have. So we have nitrogen with a subscript 2, sulfur with a subscript 5. Total number of atoms is 2 plus 5. We get 7 atoms. Number of ions, again, is 0. Let's go ahead and pause the video and you try the rest of these. Okay, we have Iii Bromide. Iron is a metal. That tells us that this is an ionic compound, so we will have ions present. The classification is a salt because there's no hydroxide here. The formula will have Fe with a 3 plus and Br with 1 minus. That means our formula will be FeBr3. The number of atoms is 1 Fe plus 3 Brs. That's a total of 4 atoms. And our total number of ions is also 4 because we have 1 iron and 3 bromide ions. Next we have hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide starts with hydrogen, which is a nonmetal, so this is a molecular type of compound. It does start with hydrogen, making it an acid. The formula then will be H with a plus, sulfide has a 2 minus. We put it together, we get H2S. Number of atoms is 3, 2 hydrogens and 1 sulfide. And finally, the number of ions is 0 because this is a molecular compound. Next, we have aluminum nitride. Aluminum is a metal, so we have an ionic compound. So we know that there will be ions present. The classification is going to be salt because there's no hydroxide. The formula, aluminum has a 3 plus. Nitride is N with a 3 negative. We put that together and our formula is AlN. Number of atoms, just 2. Number of ions, also 2. Okay, now we have disulfur heptoxide. This compound starts with sulfur. Sulfur is a nonmetal, so this tells us that this is a molecular compound. It does not start with hydrogen, so it's a covalent compound. The formula tells us what we have. So we have sulfur as our first element, 2 as a subscript, oxide, and then there's 7 of those, so we have oxygen. So our formula is S2O7. Number of atoms is 9 because we have 2 plus 7, and the number of ions is 0 because this is a molecular compound. And our last one, we have calcium phosphate. Calcium is a metal, so that tells us this is ionic, so we will have ions. The classification is salt. The formula is calcium has a 2 plus charge. Phosphate, which is PO4, put that in parentheses, has a 3 negative charge. That means our formula will be Ca subscript 3, parentheses, PO4 subscript 2. And that tells us the number of atoms are 3 calciums plus 2 phosphorus plus 8 oxygens for a total of 13 atoms. And the number of ions is, we have 3 calciums, 2 phosphates, for a total of 5 ions. Hopefully you did that well and can practice that in the exercises.